Jake Collier had always lived by the rhythm of the land up with the sun, sleep under the stars, and never stay anywhere longer than necessary. He wasn't the kind of man who chased dreams. He just followed trails. Ranching wasn't just a job for him, it was his identity. From the time he was old enough to hold a rope, he was out there with his father, branding cattle and learning how to read the sky. But lately, the road felt lonelier than it used to. His old dog passed last winter. His father, a year before that, the ranch he once worked for had been sold, and the new owner brought in machines and managers who didn't see value in men like Jake, men who worked with their hands and kept quiet. He'd been drifting ever since. On this particular summer evening, Jake was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and that suited him just fine. His rusted Ford pickup had a cracked windshield, a squeaky fan belt, and a radio that only played old country stations when it felt like it. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It gave him time to think. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the fields that rolled on like waves. Wheat, he guessed, maybe barley. He didn't know this land, but it had the same scent of dust and heat he'd known his whole life. The last road sign he passed was so faded it was barely legible. Something about Redfield, either the town ahead or the one he just missed. He didn't care much. He wasn't looking for a destination, just rest. A bite to eat, maybe a place to sleep that wasn't the cramped cab of his truck. His back ached, knees popped with every step. And the boots he wore once, a proud pair of hand-tooled leather, were now cracked and worn, held together more by habit than stitching. It was the kind of evening where even the birds seemed to be winding down. Jake saw a few swallows dive across the road, and a pair of deer watching him cautiously from the tree line. He gave them a respectful nod as he passed. He had no rifle with him, no need anymore. These days, Jake lived off canned beans and whatever small diner he found on the road, and he hadn't had a real conversation with anyone in at least 3 days. The silence wasn't bad, but it was heavy. As the light began to fade, Jake noticed a small house up ahead, a farmhouse, old but well kept. The porch light was on, soft yellow glow in the growing dusk. It looked inviting in the way that old rural homes do. Solid wood, painted shutters, a rocking chair left askew on the porch like someone had just gotten up to answer the phone. There was a clothesline off to the side, gently swaying with a breeze that seemed to whisper, "You're not as alone as you think." Jake slowed the truck to a stop just outside the gate. He didn't want to spook anyone. Country folks could be friendly, but they didn't take well to strangers showing up unannounced. He reached into the glove box and pulled out an old folded-up note that he'd written years ago. It was just a few lines explaining who he was, that he meant no harm, and that he was willing to pay a few dollars to sleep in a barn or help with morning chores. He kept it for moments like this. He stepped out of the truck, joints stiff, hat low over his eyes. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked up to the porch. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles met the wood, the door opened, and that's when everything began to change. Jake Collier had always lived by the rhythm of the land up with the sun, sleep under the stars, and never stay anywhere longer than necessary. He wasn't the kind of man who chased dreams. He just followed trails. Ranching wasn't just a job for him, it was his identity. From the time he was old enough to hold a rope, he was out there with his father, branding cattle and learning how to read the sky. But lately, the road felt lonelier than it used to. His old dog passed last winter. His father, a year before that. The ranch he once worked for had been sold, and the new owner brought in machines and managers who didn't see value in men like Jake, men who worked with their hands and kept quiet. He'd been drifting ever since. On this particular summer evening, Jake was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and that suited him just fine. His rusted Ford pickup had a cracked windshield, a squeaky fan belt, and a radio that only played old country stations when it felt like it. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet. It gave him time to think. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the fields that rolled on like waves. Wheat, he guessed. Maybe barley. He didn't know this land, but it had the same scent of dust and heat he'd known his whole life. The last road sign he passed was so faded it was barely legible. Something about Redfield, either the town ahead or the one he just missed. It didn't care much. He wasn't looking for a destination, just rest, a bite to eat, maybe a place to sleep that wasn't the cramped cab of his truck. His back ached, knees popped with every step, and the boots he wore once, a proud pair of hand-tooled leather, were now cracked and worn, held together more by habit than stitching. It was the kind of evening where even the birds seemed to be winding down. Jake saw a few swallows dive across the road and a pair of deer watching him cautiously from the tree line. He gave them a respectful nod as he passed. He had no rifle with him, no need anymore. These days, Jake lived off canned beans and whatever small diner he found on the road, and he hadn't had a real conversation with anyone in at least 3 days. The silence wasn't bad, but it was heavy. As the light began to fade, Jake noticed a small house up ahead, a farmhouse, old but well kept. The porch light was on, a soft yellow glow in the growing dusk. It looked inviting in the way that old rural homes do. Solid wood, painted shutters, a rocking chair left askew on the porch like someone had just gotten up to answer the phone. There was a clothesline off to the side, gently swaying with a breeze that seemed to whisper, "You're not as alone as you think." Jake slowed the truck to a stop just outside the gate. He didn't want to spook anyone. Country folks could be friendly, but they didn't take well to strangers showing up unannounced. He reached into the glove box and pulled out an old folded-up note that he'd written years ago. It was just a few lines explaining who he was, that he meant no harm, and that he was willing to pay a few dollars to sleep in a barn or help with morning chores. He kept it for moments like this. He stepped out of the truck, joints stiff, hat low over his eyes. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked up to the porch. He raised his hand to knock but before his knuckles met the wood. The door opened, and that's when everything began to change. Dinner was unlike anything Jake had expected and far more than he thought he deserved. He hadn't sat down to a proper home-cooked meal in months, maybe years. Most of his meals came from cans or gas station counters. Always eaten alone. Always. In silence. But here, in this strange and lively house at the edge of nowhere, he found himself seated at a long oak table with a plate piled high in front of him. Stew thick with vegetables and tender beef, golden cornbread with melting butter, and a mason jar filled with sweet tea, so sugary it nearly made him wince. Doris hovered like a proud hen, watching his every reaction as he took the first few bites. "Good?" she asked, not waiting for a response before sitting across from him, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's my mama's recipe. Ain't nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." Jake nodded slowly. "It's incredible," he said, honestly. "Haven't had anything like this in a long while." "Well, it's about time someone fed you properly," Mabel said, sitting down beside him with a satisfied smirk. "Man your size. Traveling alone. Probably lives off jerky and instant coffee." Jake chuckled softly. "You're not far off." That seemed to amuse them all. Even Ellie, the quietest of the trio, cracked a small smile from her seat at the end of the table. She hadn't spoken much since Jake arrived, but she watched carefully, listening more than she talked. Jake had met people like her before still waters, the kind that ran deep. She didn't say much, but when she did, it'd probably be worth hearing. The questions started not long after Jake was halfway through his meal. At first, they were harmless, even playful. "So where are you headed?" "Really?" Mabel asked, sipping her tea and leaning on her elbow like they were at a bar instead of a kitchen table. "Nowhere in particular," Jake said truthfully. "Just driving. Seeing where the road takes me." Doris raised a skeptical brow. "You mean you're running from something, don't you?" Jake paused for a second, surprised by how direct she was, but her tone wasn't accusatory, it was knowing, almost gentle, as if she understood more than she let on. He considered lying, saying he was visiting family, chasing work, maybe looking for land to buy. But something about the soft lighting, the smell of baked bread, and the honest eyes around him made it hard to be anything but truthful. "I guess you could say that," he admitted. "Been a long stretch of loss, job, family, some friends, just got tired of staying in one place." Ellie finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Sometimes the road feels safer than stillness." Jake looked at her, surprised by the insight, and nodded slowly. "That's exactly it." The women didn't press further. Instead, they shifted the conversation to lighter things, funny stories about neighbors. How Doris once chased a bear off the porch with a broom, and how Mabel used to sing in a local honky-tonk until a fight broke out and someone tried to steal her microphone. Jake found himself laughing more than he had in months. It was the kind of laughter that sneaks up on you, the real kind, not forced, not polite, but bubbling out of a place you forgot still worked. That as the night wore on, the dishes were cleared and replaced with slices of homemade pie. Apple, with cinnamon and a flaky crust that crumbled perfectly under the fork. The conversation slowed, grew quieter, more reflective. Jake felt the tension leave his shoulders. His boots were off, his hat resting on a chair nearby, and his heart, usually wrapped in layers of defense, had begun to ease just a little. These women, he realized, weren't just a quirky trio in a quiet farmhouse. They were guardians of a kind of warmth the world had slowly forgotten, hospitality without suspicion, care without condition. They didn't know who he really was, and they didn't seem to care. He was there. He was tired. And to them, that was reason enough to feed him, question him, and laugh with him like he was family. And for the first time in a long time, Jake began to wonder if maybe he had stumbled into the kind of place he didn't need to leave. After dinner, Jake assumed the evening would wind down. He'd thank them for the meal, maybe offer to help with the dishes, and then find his way to a corner of the porch or barn to sleep under the stars just like he always did. But the women had other ideas. Before he could even stand, Doris placed a firm hand on his shoulder and pushed him gently back into his chair. "Now, hold on," she said with a wink. "We're not done with you yet." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, you think we just feed stray men and send them off into the night?" Mabel chimed in, bringing a steaming kettle to the table and pouring hot water into 3 mismatched teacups. No, You're here now. That means you play by our rules. Jake looked between them, unsure if they were serious or just trying to mess with him. With these women, it was hard to tell. There was a playfulness in their eyes, but also something deeper, something that made him feel like he was being pulled into something larger than himself. What kind of rules are we talking about? He asked, his voice calm but cautious. Ellie, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the meal, leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. The first rule, she said, her voice low but firm, is no disappearing in the middle of the night. If you're going to stay here, even just for one night, you don't sneak out like a ghost. Jake blinked, surprised by how direct that was. I wasn't planning to good, she interrupted gently. Second rule, no acting like a guest. You're either here with us, or you're not. You eat with us, talk with us, maybe even pitch in if something needs doing. We don't like awkward silences or tiptoeing around each other. Understood? Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. All right, he said, with a nod. Fair enough. Mabel clapped her hands once. That's the spirit. Rule 3, you laugh at our jokes, even the bad ones. Especially the bad ones. Because Lord knows, Doris tells a few terrible ones. I do not. Doris protested, throwing a napkin across the table. Jake chuckled. He couldn't help it. The energy in the room was too infectious. It felt like he'd stumbled into a play with 3 seasoned actresses, each playing her role to perfection, and yet none of it felt fake. These weren't women trying to impress him. They were being exactly who they were, unfiltered and unafraid. That, more than anything, made Jake feel strangely at home. The women began clearing the table around him, moving in a rhythm that only people who'd lived together for years could manage. They handed him a damp towel without asking, and he took it without question, drying dishes while Doris washed and Mabel stacked them on the counter. Ellie disappeared briefly, only to return moments later with a folded quilt and a firm pillow. You'll sleep on the couch tonight, she said, nodding toward a large, worn but inviting piece of furniture in the living room. No barns. Porches. You're not livestock. Jake hesitated. He wasn't used to this kind of treatment, being cared for, being trusted so quickly. It made him feel vulnerable in a way that sleeping under the open sky never did. I can take the floor, he offered quietly. Really? A blanket in the corner is more than I need. You've already earned the couch, Mabel said, rinsing out the teacups. You helped with dishes. You didn't complain once, and you listened more than most men we've met. That counts for something. Jake stood there for a moment, the quilt in his arms, trying to make sense of what was happening. He came to this house as a stranger, fully expecting to be turned away, or, at best, tolerated. Instead, he'd been fed, teased, questioned, and offered warmth, both physical and emotional, in a way that caught him completely off guard. And maybe that was the thing. Maybe it wasn't just the meal or the rules or the laughter that was affecting him. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at him and seen more than a man on the run. They saw a person worth welcoming, and for a man like Jake, that was far more powerful than any place to sleep. The hours that followed dinner unfolded in a way Jake never could have predicted. He had planned on silence and curling up with a blanket in some corner and letting the night pass him by, but instead, he found himself drawn into a whirlwind of stories, laughter, and something even rarer. Comfort. The women, Mabel, Doris, and Ellie, seemed determined to peel him open, one question at a time, like he was a puzzle they'd been waiting years to solve. They all migrated to the living room, which was just as charming and mismatched as the kitchen. There were old lamps with doilies draped over their shades, a giant bookshelf that sagged in the middle from too many paperbacks, and a record player tucked beside a small stack of Johnny Cash and Loretta Lynn albums. The furniture didn't match. The couch was floral and worn. The armchair, a deep burgundy velvet, but somehow it all fit together. Like the women themselves, wildly different, yet perfectly in sync. Jake took his place on the couch, quilt folded neatly beside him, while Mabel settled into the recliner with a creak and a groan. Doris flopped onto the floor with a plate of leftover pie in her lap, and Ellie, as usual, stayed quiet, sitting near the window, knitting something that looked like a scarf, or maybe a trap, Jake thought with a smirk. So, Mabel began, tossing a pillow at Jake. You married? The question hit him like a jab, quick and unexpected. Jake shifted slightly. No, he said, eyes on the firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Not anymore. Divorced? Doris asked, not missing a beat. Widowed, he replied, softly. Silence. Just for a moment. Not awkward or heavy, just respectful. Ellie looked up from her knitting, her hands pausing mid-stitch. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. It was a long time ago. But thank you. They didn't pry, didn't ask how or why or what her name was. Instead, Mabel leaned back in her chair and said, well, that explains the way you stare into your tea, like it might solve all your problems. That broke the silence, and laughter followed, not cruel or mocking, but real, belly-deep laughter that tugged Jake out of his shell, whether he liked it or not, and to his surprise, he found himself laughing too. From there, the conversation turned lighter. Doris started telling stories, ridiculous, wildly exaggerated stories about growing up in Redfield. Like the time she supposedly convinced a mailman that the house was haunted, or how she once beat the mayor's son in a piting contest, only to throw up behind the church minutes later. Mabel countered with her own tales, including one where she dated a rodeo clown who turned out to be allergic to horses. Now that was a red flag. She laughed, wiping tears from her eyes. Even Ellie joined in, her humor dry and cutting, delivered in perfectly timed one-liners that left everyone gasping with laughter. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it landed. Jake had never felt anything quite like it. It wasn't just that they were funny, it was the way they made space for each other, like a rhythm they'd mastered long ago. No one dominated the room, no one had to. They each had their turn, their moment, and they gave Jake his too. Whenever he spoke, even if it was brief or hesitant, they listened. Not out of politeness, but genuine interest. They asked follow-up questions. They laughed at his dry remarks. They nodded when he shared something quiet or painful, and slowly, something began to shift inside him. It had been years since he'd felt seen, truly seen, not just as a cowboy or a drifter or a man passing through, but as a whole person with a story, with scars, with something left to give. These women, who had every reason to be wary of a stranger knocking at their door, had invited him in, fed him, and made him laugh until his sides ached. He didn't know what kind of magic lived in that house, but it was working on him, breaking down walls he didn't know were still up, reminding him of something he'd almost forgotten, that warmth, community, and connection still existed in the world, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep running from it. The house had grown quiet, though the air still carried a kind of energy, soft and warm, like the afterglow of a sunset. The women had retreated to their rooms, one by one, bidding Jake goodnight with sleepy smiles and casual remarks like, "Don't let the couch bite, and we snore, so you might want to find earplugs." Their footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Jake alone in the soft, flickering light of the living room. He sat for a while on the edge of the couch, quilt draped across his lap, unsure whether to lie down just yet. The fire in the hearth had long since burned out, but the warmth lingered, both from the room and from something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. It was the first time in a long time he hadn't felt the urge to move, to keep his boots on, to sleep with one eye open. The walls of the farmhouse, covered in old pictures and cross-stitched sayings, didn't make him feel trapped. They made him feel safe. Jake looked around slowly, taking in the details he'd missed earlier, the way the wooden floor creaked in the same spot every time he shifted his weight, the sound of wind brushing gently against the old windows, and the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. It wasn't fancy. Nothing here was, but it was real, honest. The kind of place where time moved slower and stories had weight. He lay back on the couch, pulling the quilt over himself. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, clean, comforting, like something a grandmother might have stored in a cedar chest. The couch cushions were soft but sturdy, and the pillow Doris had given him was surprisingly firm. It was icily the most comfortable surface he'd slept on in months. As he lay there staring up at the ceiling, Jake felt the strange hum of emotions stirring in his chest. He thought of his old life, the long days out on the open plains, the scent of cattle and sun-warmed leather, the quiet companionship of his dog, Bo. He thought of the day he buried his wife under that lone sycamore tree behind the house they once called home, and he thought of the long, lonely stretch of road that had led him here, to a porch he almost passed by, to a door he almost didn't knock on. It would have been so easy to keep driving, but he hadn't, and now, lying under a hen quilt in a house full of strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers anymore, Jake realized something rare. He didn't want to leave in the morning. That thought startled him. He'd always left. Always. It was easier to leave than to stay, easier to drift than to risk growing roots. Staying meant vulnerability. It meant dealing with grief instead of outrunning it. It meant opening himself up to people, to expectations, to the possibility of loss. But tonight didn't feel like loss. It felt like a beginning. Through the thin walls, he could hear faint laughter, Mabel and Doris, still whispering like teenagers at a sleepover. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their joy, their ease, and their strength. These women, loud and unfiltered as they were, held this home together like glue. And tonight, without question, they'd extended that shelter to him. Jake turned onto his side, one hand under the pillow, eyes beginning to close. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't counting the hours until dawn. He wasn't listening for trouble outside or mentally plotting his next stop. Instead, he let the quiet lull him. Not the silence of loneliness, but the stillness of peace. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, then the soft thud of a closing door. Then, nothing but the whisper of wind outside and the steady beat of his own breathing. Jake smiled faintly in the dark. He was still a man who belonged to the road, but maybe, just maybe, this house was the first place that had ever made the road feel like it could end. Morning came gently in Redfield. Jake woke to the sound of clinking pans and the faint hum of a radio playing an old country tune, Patsy Cline, maybe, or Dolly Parton. It was hard to tell through the fog of sleep. The living room was bathed in golden light from the rising sun, filtering in through gauzy curtains and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The quilt had slipped halfway off, but the warmth of the room made it unnecessary. For the first time in years, Jake had slept straight through the night. No tossing. No waking in a cold sweat. Just sleep. He sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness out of his back, and looked around as though half expecting the night before to have been a dream. But there were his boots, neatly placed beside the couch. There was the mug from last night, still on the coffee table, and from the kitchen came the sound of Doris laughing full-bodied and unfiltered. "Morning, Cowboy," she called as she caught sight of him shuffling down the hall. "Hope the couch treated you better than a truck seat." Jake smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll admit it did." He stepped into the kitchen to find the three women already in motion. Doris was manning the stove, flipping biscuits and humming off-key. Mabel was seated at the table, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper that looked older than Jake's pickup. Ellie stood near the back door, her arms crossed, watching two chickens pecking at the gravel outside like she was waiting for them to misbehave. "Grab a plate," Mabel said without looking up. "And don't just stand there, you've got chores today." Jake raised an eyebrow, amused. "Do I now? You think you eat for free around here?" Doris said, grinning. "We're generous, not stupid." It was all in good fun, but Jake found himself nodding seriously. "All right," he said. "What needs doing?" And just like that, he was part of it. They put him to work right after breakfast. Nothing fancy, just helping fix a section of fence that had been leaning for months, feeding the hens, and hauling a few stubborn sacks of feed from the shed to the back porch. The work was familiar, grounding. Jake moved with practiced ease, his hands remembering things his mind had nearly forgotten: the way to brace a post in soft earth, how to calm a nervous goat, the rhythm of a shovel slicing through gravel. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of his neck, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the sweetness of lilac from a nearby bush. Ellie came out once to bring him water, watching him wordlessly as he hammered a board into place. She didn't say much, just handed him the glass and nodded with quiet approval before heading back inside. By midday, Jake had already started to forget he didn't belong there. He and Mabel repaired a latch on the chicken coop, joking as they worked. "You've got strong hands," she said, handing him a screwdriver. "You sure you haven't done this before?" Jake smiled faintly. Once or twice. Doris brought lunch out to the porch, stick sandwiches on homemade bread, slices of cold peach pie, and iced tea in mason jars. They sat under the shade of the awning, talking and eating and swatting at flies like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe Jake thought it was. The chores weren't just tasks, they were connection. The women didn't need him to fix a fence or feed the chickens. They'd managed just fine without him for years. But in giving him those tasks, they gave him something far more valuable: a place, a purpose, even if only for a moment. The road hadn't given him that. The road had always taken time, energy, people. This place was different. These women were different. They didn't ask why he stayed after breakfast. They didn't remind him he'd said he'd leave. By dawn, they just made room for him at the table, in the work, in the flow of their lives. No pressure, no questions, just quiet acceptance. And Jake, for the first time in a very long while, didn't want to go. Jake never made it to the next town. He told himself that he would just one more night, one more meal, and he'd be back on the road. But the morning slipped into afternoon, and the afternoon folded into evening, and still, he stayed. The truck sat in the driveway, sunbaked and gathering dust, like it knew its job was done for now. Jake would glance at it occasionally, half expecting guilt to rise in his chest. It never did. Something about Redfield, the land, the house, the women, him. But it wasn't just the place. It was the feeling. And feelings, Jake had learned the hard way, were harder to outrun than any storm on the plains. He stayed another night, and then another. By the end of the week, he had fixed the barn door, repaired a broken clothesline, and built a small pen. For a new goat Ellie had been considering buying, he'd found himself waiting for Doris's morning biscuits, anticipating Mabel's midday sarcasm, and even looking forward to Ellie's quiet company when she joined him for afternoon walks. Down the dirt road, she never said much, but her silence was comforting in a way that filled the air rather than emptied it. Jake still slept on the couch at least, until Mabel announced one morning, "You're too tall to keep folding yourself in half like that. There's a guest room down the hall. Clean sheets. You've earned it." He didn't argue, not anymore. As the days went by, Jake's rough edges began to soften. His shoulders no longer hunched with caution. He smiled without flinching. He laughed easily. And he really listened to the stories the women told. To the wind rustling through the trees, to the way the house creaked and settled around him like it was making room. What surprised him most wasn't how much he liked being there. It was how little he missed being anywhere else. One afternoon, while he was painting the picket fence with a task, Mabel insisted was completely unnecessary but charming. A car pulled up to the driveway. A man stepped out, holding a clipboard and wearing a pressed shirt with a real estate company logo on the chest. "I'm here to speak with the owners about their property listing," the man said, eyeing Jake cautiously. Jake frowned. "This place isn't for sale." The man checked his paper. "I've got it on record. Listed 6 months ago. Some kind of backup plan, I suppose. I was told to follow up." Jake turned toward the house, just as Doris came out onto the porch. Her face said it all: surprise, hesitation, a flicker of regret. She stepped down the stairs and joined Jake at the fence. "We listed it a while back," she admitted. "Thought maybe we'd need to move closer to town. We're not getting younger. Things were getting harder." Jake nodded slowly. The idea of their place being sold, emptied, replaced by something new and sterile made his stomach twist. "But now," she continued, casting a glance his way, "now we're not so sure." The man left with nothing more than a polite nod and a business card. Jake watched his car disappear down the road, then looked at Doris. "You thinking of staying?" he asked. Doris smiled softly. "We were never the ones leaving. We were just waiting for something or someone to remind us why we stayed in the first place." Jake didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That night, they all sat out on the porch together. The sun set slowly over the fields, painting the sky in strokes of orange, purple, and gold. Crickets chirped, fireflies blinked to life, and somewhere off in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Jake leaned back in his chair, a mug of coffee in his hand, and let the quiet settle around him. He hadn't planned on staying, but life, it seemed, had other plans.